As soon as he came to power, the king of Egypt, Sety I, or Men-Ma'at-Ra, would need to start planning for his future. Not the future of his reign, that would be handled day by day and decision by decision. No, he needed to plan for the future of eternity. One of the king's first deeds after ascending the throne and taking the crowns upon his head would be to choose and plan his tomb, his place of rest in the kingdom of Osiris, the afterlife or Duat. The construction of this tomb was an enormous project, and it would take the rest of his reign. Salam alaikum, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. Episode 197, How to Make a Pharaoh's Tomb. Compared to the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and even the 18th dynasty just before, the Ramessid era of the 19th and 20th dynasties is remarkably well attested in terms of tomb building. Thanks to texts and archaeological material from the village of Deir el-Medina and the Valley of the Kings, we have a lot of information about the construction of the royal burials. Archaeologists have uncovered written records describing the work, the tools themselves used by the builders, and artistic images that illuminate the techniques used to achieve these architectural marvels. If we take sources from the 19th and 20th dynasties between 1300 and 1070 BCE, we can build a reasonably detailed picture of the tomb construction itself. With that, we can imagine the process of creating Sety I's magnificent monument. To begin the project, the ancients first had to choose a site. This probably happened immediately after Sety I came to power. The king, or one of his officials, might visit the Valley of the Kings in order to scout a suitable location for the construction of the tomb. In Sety's case, it's pretty easy to figure out the logic for the choice of location. The tomb of Sety I is right next door to the burial of his father, Ramesses I. The graves of father and son sit side by side in a central portion of the main valley. You can imagine that as the funeral for Ramesses I took place, royal overseers had already started work on Sety's magnificent tomb. Logistically, the site of a royal tomb would be dictated by four major factors. Firstly, the available space and locations in the valley would be a major consideration. Then, the builders would have to look at the bedrock in those locations, the quality and reliability of the subsurface material. They would also have to consider the intended layout and size of the tomb, whether the site could support a monument of the intended scale. Finally, they would need to consider the age and likely longevity of the reigning monarch. If the king came to power as an old man, like Ramesses I, he probably wasn't going to live long enough to construct something huge. For a slightly younger man, like Sety, there was a bit more leeway. Obviously, plans can go wrong. The king might fall sick, be injured, or even murdered, cutting short the timeline of his tomb construction. But generally speaking, the younger a ruler was at his accession, the more time they likely had to complete their monument. That would be a factor in choosing the location. Once the site was chosen, the royal planners could lay out their design. For the tomb of Sety I, this was a straightforward process. Literally. The king's tomb is a direct continuation of the model used by Horemheb. In fact, the tomb of Sety I is nearly identical to that of his predecessor. This makes sense. King Ramesses I, Sety's father, had only ruled for 18 months, maybe 2 years at most. So the funeral of King Horemheb took place just a couple of years before workers started to build the tomb of Sety I. With that in mind, we should look at these monuments as part of the same architectural tradition, produced by the same generation of workers. That should have made the planning phase relatively simple. Sety's officials could bring out the documents they, or their predecessors, had used for King Horemheb, and those would serve as a template for the new royal tomb. Sety's architects did make a couple of tweaks and improvements on what had come before. they added some extra chambers and a couple of extensions to the overall plan of the tomb. But if you compare the monuments of Horemheb and Sety side by side, they are almost identical. The creative phase of planning might have been quite simple. Take what they had done, make a few adjustments, and then begin. Speaking of plans, how did the ancients actually do that? Did they create blueprints or templates which they could follow when building? Well, for the time of Sety I, we don't know for sure, but about 100 years after this king, we do have a couple of records from the 20th dynasty. In the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, there is a fragmentary papyrus from the reign of Ramesses IV. This papyrus is remarkable because it shows the design and layout of that pharaoh's tomb. The papyrus is dominated by a series of rectangles and squares drawn in black ink. They run from right to left, and they are divided up into the corridors and chambers that make up the actual tomb. Each area is separated by a small rectangle, which is the door, and the whole design is surrounded by a series of red dots that show the mountain in which the tomb was carved. The document is amazing. It is our earliest surviving example of an architectural blueprint that shows the plans of an ancient builder who was organizing the project. The texts written on the papyrus give the names of the various rooms and describe their measurements and decoration. At the start of the papyrus, for example, one of the corridors is labeled as, quote, "the fourth corridor, measuring 25 cubits in length and 6 cubits in width. The ceiling is 9 cubits and 4 palms in height," end quote. So the architect describes each section and room accurately, with records of the measurements for length, width, and height. For those wondering, a cubit is approximately 52 centimeters long, so if the corridor has a length of 25 cubits, that is about 12.5 meters. This matches pretty closely with the actual tomb itself. In 1917, the Egyptologists Howard Carter and Alan Gardner published a study of this papyrus and the tomb of Ramesses IV. And according to Howard Carter, the measurements only vary by a few centimeters total. So the ancient architects had a pretty strong grasp of the dimensions and measurements they were using. That may seem obvious, given these are royal projects with incredible religious and practical importance, but documents like the Turin Papyrus do help us confirm the ancient methods and practices. So the architects had planned their work, they had chosen a site, and they had settled on the design. With the king's approval, the work could now begin in earnest. To initiate construction, there would be an important ceremony. Priests and high-ranking officials would consecrate the ground and prepare the area for work. We know they did this thanks to a few archaeological discoveries. Throughout the Valley of the Kings, excavators have uncovered small caches or deposits of items. These appear to be intentional burials set up outside of tombs at the start of the building process. These discoveries are usually called foundation deposits, and they also show up at temples as part of the consecration ritual. In a foundation deposit, the ancients would bury a small cache of goods. These tend to be items of religious, political, and practical symbolism. They include things like faience plaques, which bear the names of their rulers, copper or bronze tools like chisels, knives, axes, and hoes or adzes for digging. They also have wooden tools like small scaffolds for making bricks, and wedges for splitting stone. They have vessels made of pottery or stone, including vases, dishes, and cups. They have baskets, usually made from papyrus reeds or rushes, and they even have food offerings with meat, fruit, or bread. The foundation deposits seem to be an important part of starting the building project, a way of consecrating the ground, perhaps satisfying the deities or spirits who watch over the necropolis, and maybe ensuring good luck for the construction itself. Once the ground was consecrated, it was finally time to dig. At this point, the tomb builders themselves would step forward to begin the construction process. The tomb builders for the Valley of the Kings are a well-recorded group, and we know a great deal about them thanks to archaeological and historical work in a nearby village called Deir el-Medina. Deir el-Medina, which is just over the mountain from the Valley of the Kings, is the home of the tomb builders. It is where they lived and organized their projects. It is also a treasure trove of written and archaeological records, and thanks to generations of excavation and historical work, we have an excellent understanding of this community, both as a group and as individuals. From this information, scholars can reconstruct the process and organization for building a royal tomb. The builders were a designated profession, and they were known collectively as the Gang, or Ta Iset. More specifically, they were called the Gang of the Tomb, Ta Iset en Pa Her. Once they arrived on site to begin building, the gang was divided into two subgroups. These groups would each take one half of the monument, specifically the left-hand and right-hand sides of the building. These sub-gangs were called Tarit Wenemi and Tarit Semechi, respectively. It's not clear how strict the divisions were. Presumably, workers might go between each side of the tomb when there were gaps in the workforce. Maybe somebody on the left-hand side was absent on a particular day, or maybe there was somebody on the right-hand side who had a particular specialty or experience, and they might consult or advise on problems or issues. Presumably, there would be some flexibility in the organization, at least to keep things moving and working effectively, but we can only speculate. All we know is that, officially, the workforce was divided in two, one working on the left, one working on the right. Anyway, as the tomb building started, the workers were going directly into the rock of the Valley of the Kings. Thanks to the foundation deposits discovered in this area, and tools found at Deir el-Medina, we have a good idea of the methods and implements they would use. Surviving artifacts include wooden hammers and mallets. These tend to look like maces or clubs. They have a short handle and a large bulbous end, which the worker would use to pound or strike their implement. Their other tools included chisels, usually made of bronze or hardened copper. These had a variety of names. There was a type of chisel called a spike, or kha, and a pickaxe, or kerjen. There was also a wide, flat chisel called a medjat, and these would all be used at different stages of the process. From the records discovered at Deir el-Medina, it seems like the tools, especially the metal ones, were actually owned and controlled by the royal administration. We have written documents that describe the distribution of new tools for the workers, and even the collection of old tools that had become worn down and broken. Those tools would be taken away to the workshops, where they would be melted down, recycled, and turned into new tools. These would then be delivered back to the village, ready for the workers to use. All of these processes are described in written documents recovered at Deir el-Medina. We'll explore them in more detail in the future, but they tell us a lot about the organization of these projects. The tools were incredibly valuable, and the royal government took direct responsibility for their maintenance. The work of building a royal tomb was dominated by digging. The ancients had two words for this process. They called it digging, or wa'a, and breaking the stone, or wedja. The excavation work was done by specialists, who were known as the stone cutters, or herti netcher. These men were responsible for cutting into the living rock to excavate the entrance, corridors, and chambers of the monument itself. Again, we have records from the 19th and 20th dynasties that describe aspects of this work. The actual process of digging was known as the pushing forward, or pa head cheften, and it seems to have been reported regularly to the king's administration. In the early reign of Ramesses II, for example, we have a letter written to the king that describes the start of work on a royal tomb. This letter mentions cutting the first door, or seba tepi, on one of the king's monuments. A few decades later, around 1200 BCE, A progress report for the king Sety I mentions the cutting of stone and the removal of rock for the building of the tomb. This report even describes the speed of the construction itself. The message for King Sety I claims that the builders had cut 7 to 9 meters of stone, about 13.5 cubits, in just 14 days. So their progress was rapid. It's not clear if this speed was normal. Logically, the construction of each tomb would vary depending on the quality of the bedrock and also the size of the workforce that was available. So we can only speculate on the average speed of a tomb's construction. Unfortunately, there's no obvious correlation. No matter how long or how short a king reigned, the size of their tomb does not necessarily match. But the messages for Ramesses and Sety I give us an idea of a well-documented process. As the stonecutters, or Hertinetcher, were digging into the earth, their overseers sent regular progress reports. We even have artistic images that show the stonecutters at work. If you go to the Luxor Museum in Egypt, you can see a small flake of limestone. This is called an ostracon, and it bears an image drawn in black ink. That image shows the corridor, doorway, and staircase of a tomb, with a group of workers on each side who are cutting the walls and hauling away the debris. It's not clear which tomb this ostracon depicts, but the artist has shown the workers in great detail. They even clutch their little mallets and a specific style of chisel. So again, we get a sense of the building process as a particularly well-recorded event. Officials were sending messages to the administration, and even the builders themselves were making little doodles of their work. It's really cool. As the workers dug and quarried out the rock, they would slowly create corridors that descended into the hill. In the tomb of Sety I, this began with a long staircase reaching down to the entrance, then a corridor, a second staircase, and a second corridor, plunging ever downward. As they went, the tomb builders would gradually go further and further away from the light. The tomb would become darker and darker, and it would be more and more difficult to see what they were doing. As they reached the lower portions of the monument, which were now deep into the hillside, things would really be quite gloomy. So how did the builders actually light their workspace? Based on archaeological and artistic references, we have an idea of the lamps they would use. As far as we can tell, the tomb builder's lamp was quite simple, a dish or saucer made of terracotta. The dish was filled up with fuel and then lit with a wick. The wick was made of linen twisted into a taper, and it was called a khebes. These wicks were sometimes made from old rags or clothes, and written records from Deir el-Medina describe the villagers manufacturing them. For the fuel, the ancients had a few options. The main one seems to have been animal fat or tallow, which they called segenin. They could also use olive oil or nechek, and sometimes there is a specific animal fat that is used for burning. This was called the ajwaj en seta. So the terracotta dish of the lamp would be filled with this oil or fat, and then the wick or khebes was added in the middle. That kind of lamp might produce a large and bright flame, but it could also produce a lot of smoke. Interestingly, the ancients had a solution for that. Records from Deir el-Medina describe the builders adding salt, or chemite, to the lamp itself, in order to reduce smoking and prevent damage to their lungs or the tomb. The lamps must have been reasonably effective. The tomb of Sety I, for example, is exquisitely decorated in high-quality carving in every single chamber. No matter how deep or far from the light, the artists had enough illumination to carve and smooth the walls and prepare beautiful scenes. So maybe placing several of these lamps around each corridor and chamber was enough to compensate for the depth and the darkness. Interestingly, the records from Deir el-Medina suggest that the lamps were another high-quality item in which the royal administration took a special interest. Like the copper tools, we have records of government officials gathering up the lamps, especially the wicks or khebes, and then redistributing them for projects. Apparently, the lamps were quite valuable and strictly controlled. This makes sense. Along with the copper tools, sources of lighting were essential for constructing and decorating these monuments. On top of that, the animal fats and oils used for the fuel, those were valuable and perishable. But the ancients did not have many methods for long-term preservation and storage. So much of the oil and fat had to be produced and delivered quickly. Naturally, the workers themselves did not have time to organize all of that while still digging and decorating these monuments. So this was one of the jobs of the royal administration. It gives us a wonderfully detailed picture of the business of building these monuments. Week by week, year by year, these stonecutters would dig further and further into the hill. For the tomb of Sety I, this was a mammoth undertaking. The main body of the tomb cuts 137 meters into the bedrock. That is 449 feet approximately. It also has a number of side chambers that branch off from the main axis and add a great deal more work on top of the overall length. As a result, the builders had to extract an enormous quantity of rock. Every meter of cutting produced a large quantity of debris that had to be ported away in baskets. Again, this was an enormous task. The area of Sety's tomb is approximately 1900 cubic meters, which would have required the builders to dig out 5,150,900 kilograms of stone. That is 11,355,790 pounds. You can imagine the scale of this project. Every chunk of debris had to be removed by hand, carried by porters using baskets. They would make their way up the passages and staircases of the tomb in order to dump the rubble out in a convenient location. Unfortunately, that task would get more difficult the deeper the builders went. As the corridors and staircases multiplied and the length of the tomb increased, you would need more and more porters in order to maintain a steady rhythm. As a result, the workforce would increase the deeper they went in the hill. Put these factors together, and you can imagine the construction of a royal tomb would start out relatively quick and efficient. The digging of the first staircase and corridors, for example, might progress rapidly, with a relatively small workforce cutting the stone and removing the debris. But the deeper they went, the longer the corridors and halls stretched. The more porters would be required to take away the rubble at a quick and efficient pace. The more lamps would be required to light the deepening gloom. The more chisels were demanded as chambers opened out and the workers had to cut more surface area. Finally, all of this would have required larger and larger workforces, with greater supplies of food and drink every single season. All of this adds up to make the tomb of Sety I, and others like it, incredibly expensive projects. We can't estimate exactly how much they would cost, but thinking about the relative wealth and population size of the time versus today, these might be equivalent to the major skyscrapers of huge metropolitan cities. Then there was the decoration. The tomb of Sety I is decorated in the same style as that of Horemheb. The artists drew sketches onto the walls, planning out the scenes using red and black inks. Then, once the scenes were finalized, they went to the walls themselves and carefully carved the outlines of the figures away from the rock. There are two ways to do this. One style, called sunk relief, involves cutting the figures directly into the rock. So you have the flat surface, and then when a person or deity appears, the artist has dug inwards to give them their outline and features. The other style is called raised relief. This one is much more difficult. It involves cutting the stone around the figures so that each one stands out above the surface. The tomb of Sety I uses the raised relief style. The artists had to carefully sculpt each figure and hieroglyph so that it stood out directly from the wall. The raised relief was much more difficult, as you can imagine. It required a great deal more care and precision, and it also took longer, with the removal of more stone chipped away with chisels. The subject matter of Sety's decoration is fairly standard and quite similar to the tomb of Horemheb. There are images of the king before the deities, but there are also the religious texts, including the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Amduat, a text called the Litany of Ra, the Opening of the Mouth, and a new one called the Book of the Sky Cow. We will explore these texts and other aspects of the decoration in future episodes. Long story short, Sety's monument is quite thorough in the details and variety of its decoration. Over the course of Sety's reign, approximately 11 years long, the builders managed an incredible feat. They dug a tomb that was 137 meters long in its main part, that included a full suite of chambers according to the model laid down by Horemheb. It had a rich variety of texts and imagery to inform the king's afterlife, and all of it represented a massive undertaking in the numbers of laborers, the hours of work, and the physical supplies required. Today, when we visit the monument of Sety I, we see an artistic and architectural masterpiece. But behind those walls, carved into the stone, is the labor of thousands of individuals. Some highly skilled artists and sculptors working on the finest details, but then many more behind the scenes, the porters who laboriously removed the rock basket by basket, the extended families, including women and children, who supported the artists with the production of items and maintenance of the home, and the extended royal bureaucracy that organized and recorded the deliveries of goods, and maintained workshops and farms that fed this community's needs. It's not an exaggeration to say that a tomb like Sety's represents something of a national project, requiring the labor of countless individuals to achieve the finished product. In its architectural perfection and the beauty of its decoration, the work speaks for itself. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. This is our first chapter exploring the tomb of Sety I. We will return to discuss additional aspects, most notably the decoration, the objects found within it, and one curious feature that extends off the main monument. The tomb of Sety I has a secret tunnel going further into the hillside. We will explore that and other questions in upcoming episodes. For now, it is time to bring this discussion to a close. Next time, we're going to leave the tomb of Sety I and travel up over the hill out of the Valley of the Kings, and go to the village of Deir el-Medina. Around 1300 BCE, the village of the tomb builders enters its golden age. Records and archaeological material proliferate and give us abundant insights into the community as a whole, the people and families who comprised it, and the life they led in the hills west of the Nile. Next time, we will begin to explore some of those tales and meet the servants in the place of truth. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I would especially like to thank the wonderful folks who have joined my Patreon and helped provide me with the food and lamps I need to produce these episodes late into the night. I would especially like to thank the priests, my top-tier supporters, whose generosity is unmatched. Special thanks to Linda, Eric, TJ, Terry, Yola, Mykost, Andy and Chelsea, Niden, Kyla, Ashley, James, Veronica, and Arthur. Folks, you are all too generous. I would also like to welcome Karen Baudouin to the ranks of the priesthood. Karen, thank you for joining. You are far too kind, and I am in your debt. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. May the great deities of the Western necropolis, Hathor and Meret Seger, she who loves silence, protect your homes and maintain security in your secret places. May you enjoy an eternity of splendors, like Sety I. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.